If the U.S. has the loudmouth Donald Trump, and Russia boasts the verbal grenade launcher Medvedev with his explosive bluntness, then China is no less formidable with its own wordsmith executioner, Wang Yi. Recently, in a high-level diplomatic meeting with EU's top foreign envoy, Kos, Foreign Minister Wang Yi left the entire conference in stunned silence when he firmly declared, "Russia must not be allowed to fail in the conflict with Ukraine." That statement pierced through the rhetorical veil of Washington's containment policy like a strategic spear. For a country that has consistently maintained it is not involved in the Russia-Ukraine war, Wang Yi's words revealed China's silent yet powerful influence on the battlefield. What then is Beijing's strategy in this conflict? And what message was Wang trying to send to the West? Welcome to the Leader Files. Wang Yi shook the West. Russia must not fail. Just 6 words, but enough to paralyze every effort from Brussels to Washington aimed at isolating Moscow. A short, sharp message, but a quiet warning. If you attack Russia, you are touching the entire strategic axis that Beijing has been silently rebuilding. And yet that was not even the most uncomfortable truth that Western politicians had to swallow. In footage leaked from the closed-door meeting, Wang Yi appeared calm, yet exuded control. For 4 uninterrupted hours, he didn't evade, but rather led the dialogue, while Ms. Cass, known for her tough stance against both Russia and China, sat mostly silent, eyes downcast, face tense. A 4-hour dialogue with a figure like Cass would usually signal compromise, but not for Wang. This was not submission nor persuasion. It was a declaration. China is fully conscious of its choices and refuses to be lectured by anyone from Brussels or Washington. When Ms. Kos bluntly accused China of shielding Russia in the Ukraine conflict, Wang did not resort to Western-style diplomatic evasiveness. Instead, he rewound history, from NATO's post-Cold War expansion to the imbalance in global order, and coldly asked, "Who's the real provocateur here?" The meeting shifted. He started posing question after question, using history as a weapon, turning the meeting room into a political classroom. But this was no harmless lecture. His opponent wasn't just an EU representative. She was a politician from Estonia, a small Baltic state that often acts as a loudspeaker whenever NATO or the US needs to amplify anti-Russia or anti-China rhetoric. But this time, China chose not to respond with official statements. Instead, it answered through a silent, strategic conversation loaded with political implications. Perhaps the most uncomfortable part for the West wasn't Wang's sarcasm, but his brutal honesty. He pointedly said what Europe doesn't want to hear. The EU keeps preaching strategic autonomy, yet every time a crisis looms, it turns to Washington for guidance. That's what Beijing disdains. A Europe that can't make its own decisions, that shouts loudly but still lives under America's shadow. Wang even implied that if Brussels doesn't change its attitude, the upcoming China-EU summit might be shortened or downgraded. This wasn't merely a diplomatic warning. It was Beijing making clear China is willing to talk, but not with puppets who negotiate while waiting for cues from across the Atlantic. This assertiveness wasn't spontaneous. Over decades in diplomacy, Wang Yi has cultivated an image of both calm professionalism and sharp retaliation. His diplomatic style, a velvet-gloved steel blade, has become emblematic of China's modern foreign policy. For over a decade as foreign minister, he's been a permanent fixture at global forums like ASEAN, the UN, and the G20. Behind his composed demeanor and measured words, Wang never hesitated to deliver cutting arguments, often directly confronting the West. He has repeatedly rebutted US and EU accusations on issues like the South China Sea, human rights, and Taiwan, with tight strategic counterarguments that left Washington and Brussels wary every time China spoke. One of his most striking moments came at the Munich Security Conference, where he boldly called NATO a Cold War relic and warned that inviting Ukraine into the alliance was like pouring gasoline on a burning fire. Even at the United Nations, traditionally a platform where China avoids strong rhetoric, Wang once stopped a German representative mid-speech with a simple interjection. "China does not interfere in Germany's internal affairs. Can Germany guarantee the same toward China?" A short response, but it choked the entire moral framework the West often uses to exert pressure. That's Wang Yi's method. Instead of responding with debate logic, he reacts with positional logic, forcing the other side to confront their own limits. These so-called diplomatic desk slams, as the media describes them, reveal not just Wang's personal strength, but China's broader diplomatic thinking. Tough, calculated, and ready to strike when core interests are at stake. So what is China's strategy? In the global geopolitical chessboard, no player wants to be cornered. But in today's post-pandemic world, amid the Ukraine war and a turbulent multipolar transition, Russia and China find themselves in a unique position. Either they stand together or get isolated and crushed, one by one. The growing closeness between Moscow and Beijing is not just a temporary convenience. It's an inevitable outcome of the tightening strategic net around both powers. For Russia, the war in Ukraine is not just a special military operation, as they call it. It's a fight for survival, to preserve what's left of its shrinking geopolitical space after NATO's expansion. For China, Russia's collapse would allow the U.S. and its allies to fully shift their focus to the Indo-Pacific, where Taiwan, the South China Sea, and global supply chains are critical pressure points Beijing must defend. So China's support for Russia is not ideological, it's strategic. Russia must not fail is a cold admission. If Moscow falls, China is next in line for Western geopolitical pressure. That's why China has chosen the role of strategic rear base for Russia, a form of covert yet total support. Enough to prevent Russia from being suffocated. China is now Russia's economic and technological lifeline, buying more oil and gas, supplying dual-use equipment, offering alternatives to SWIFT, and shielding Moscow diplomatically in forums like BRICS, the SCO, and the UN. Crucially, Beijing is not urging Moscow to end the war, because a Russia still fighting, but not defeated, is the best buffer China can ask for. It buys Beijing time to prepare for even bigger geopolitical confrontations. In classic military strategy, opening secondary fronts disperses enemy forces and relieves pressure from the main theater. China understands this better than anyone. By helping Russia sustain the war in Ukraine, Beijing is forcing the U.S. and its allies to spread themselves thin, preventing them from focusing all their strength on East Asia, where China is still consolidating its position. One must face this reality. The U.S. is not only bogged down in Ukraine with hundreds of billions in military aid, but it's also being pulled into the Middle East quagmire, where the Israel-Iran conflict, Hezbollah threats, and Gulf instability are forcing the Pentagon to deploy more aircraft carriers, bombers, and missile defenses. Meanwhile, Europe, from Germany to Poland, is rearming, balancing between supporting Ukraine and preparing for possible escalation with Russia. Amid this distraction, China has space to move. It's steadily enhancing its strategic advantages in the Pacific, pressuring Taiwan, militarizing the South China Sea, and expanding its presence on artificial islands, knowing full well that the U.S. can't respond with full force right now. That's why Beijing doesn't want Russia to win too quickly, but also cannot afford to let it fall. A sanctioned, depleted, but surviving Russia is the perfect condition for China to expand its global strategic room. With the U.S. divided across two major fronts, Ukraine to the west, Iran to the south, Taiwan in the east becomes an increasingly viable target in Beijing's calculations. China doesn't hide its ambition. Reunifying Taiwan is a historic mission. But Beijing also knows the risks of moving too early. The thing is, that moment may be approaching faster than ever. A distracted U.S., an exhausted Europe, and a world overwhelmed by energy, food, currency, and border crises all create a window where Beijing can test coercive measures short of full war. Air and naval blockades, cyber attacks, radar jamming, psychological and economic warfare, slowly paralyzing Taiwan from within. If global reactions remain muted, China could go further. This isn't speculation, it's strategic logic. Beijing doesn't attack without high odds of success, but it also doesn't miss strategic openings. In today's unpredictable multipolar world, vague alliances become survival necessities. Russia and China no longer have a choice but to stand side by side. While Moscow needs Beijing to survive, Beijing needs Moscow to buy time and stretch its opponents. And in that precious time, Taiwan, the final piece of China's national rejuvenation dream, may be the next move. Never before has the risk of conflict in the Taiwan Strait felt so real and so well prepared. Never before has China had this many favorable conditions for action. If the world doesn't read the signals correctly, Beijing's move could come sooner than anyone expects. In this grand strategic game, Wang Yi is more than a diplomat. He's the official voice of China's silent but calculated steps. And when he declares that Russia must not fail, it's not just diplomacy, it's a warning, and perhaps a preview of what comes next.